panelists today in helping understand what industry looks like, what are the next steps that we should take, and where we should head. So give me 1 second to make sure everything is working great, and I'll be with you in just a short while. All right, here we are. We are in the midst of a huge pandemic that has hit us from nowhere. Nobody was ready for it. Nobody was expecting it, and it's happened to all of us very, very sudden. This is April the 8th, Wednesday. We're expecting surges of COVID-19 in some parts of the world. Some parts of the world have recovered, but given the state of what's happening, I think we're amidst all of it right now, and we have to find a way to bounce back, to come out of this. With me today, I have an amazing panel of experts, and I'll quickly tell their names. I have David Stanton, Mr. Supply Chain expert, author, best-selling author, Abe Ashkenazi, CEO of ASCM, Andrew Myers, research director at IDC, Bob Tribble, editorial director at SCM Review, and I have John Monarch, CEO of ShipChain. And myself, Ian Khan, technology futurist, author, and just serving the industry in bringing everybody together. Let's do a quick round of insights with everybody who's on the panel. Let's start with let's start with Andrew. Andrew, tell us a little bit about what are you seeing? Where are you with respect to helping others understand the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains? You work very intensively in the oil and gas industry, and I have very specific questions for you later on as well. Up to you.
Sure. So thanks, Ian. First of all, I mean, oil and gas in and of itself might be one of the most bamboozled industries to begin with prior to COVID-19, just because there are a lot of supply, there's a lot of fundamental issues with supply demand prior to the pandemic. So they're all throughout the supply chain or the value chain through the industry. We're seeing trying to find ways to continue workflows, but to address some of the archaic ways and processes throughout the value chain to keep operations going. So I think what the shape of the recovery is going to have a tremendous impact on oil and gas processes, for decades to come.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So oil and gas is already going through some issues even before the pandemic, and there's some really interesting developments that are taking place globally. So if you've noticed the gas prices right now at the pump, you'll see that they have really tanked down, and there's a reason for that, and we'll come to that in next few minutes. I want to go to Abe Ashkenazi, CEO of the Association of Supply Chain Management. Abe, tell us, what are you seeing as your initial insights with respect to today?
Yeah, it's thanks, Ian, and thank you for putting this together. And more importantly, hopefully everybody is safe and healthy, the viewers and the listeners here. The fundamental shifts that are occurring are being played out on TV and in everybody's boardroom, as well as everybody's living room and kitchen today. Not less than 2 to 3 months ago, we had to explain what supply chain was to individuals so they could understand the impact and the benefit of it. Today, we're having to defend supply chain and the benefits and the challenges that it's encountered in addressing not only the pandemic, but the resulting economic challenges that are going to follow on to this. We're going to see a fundamental shift in supply chain, not only in demand, but in terms of manufacturing, raw materials, global dependence or independence, as it may turn out to be, in a variety of different verticals here. The challenge that we have is that we need to take a look at almost every industry separately for their supply chain. So you referenced oil and gas, we've got consumer products, we've got food, we've got health, care. Each of these supply chains are going to go through a fundamental shift, not only in terms of manufacturing capacity, but serving the consumer and the patient at the end of the day and the impact that supply chain has. As a benefit, individuals will become much more informed about supply chain and the impact that it has on their lives. That's a benefit to everybody in the economy and across the globe.
So we should expect something, a bigger effect, a bigger impact going down the few months, maybe down the next few years, and we don't know what that impact will be. But that's really a great point that we should expect something to change, and things, as people say these days, the world will never be the same. And we'll see. We'll go a little bit deeper into what some of those supply chains will look like. Let's go to Mr. Supply Chain. Daniel Standen is best-selling author of Supply Chain for Dummies. He's a consultant, author, industry influencer. Daniel, what are you seeing as this disruption that's taking place in industry today?
Ian, if there's one thing that I think really everybody needs to understand, to be watching for right now, it's this concept of the bullwhip effect. So the bullwhip effect was first identified by an MIT professor by the name of Jay Forrester, probably 50 years ago now. And what Forrester realized is that when you make small changes in a supply chain, either in supply or demand, those changes get amplified as they move upstream. So if a consumer buys a little bit more of an item, that creates a bigger change in the demand signal for the wholesaler, and that gets amplified again going up to the distributor and to the manufacturer and the raw material suppliers. What we're seeing right now is really three different changes in demand. There are some things for where there's been a spike in demand, but the consumption really hasn't changed. That's, I think toilet paper is a great example there. Well, that creates these bullwhip effects that lead to stockouts at one point in a supply chain and excess inventory at another. But then we've also had changes in demand where we're increasing demand and we're increasing consumption. I think, things like hand sanitizer and N95 masks fit in really well there. And then the third category of demand disruptions are where the demand is actually dropped off and the consumption has dropped off. Anything related to entertainment or sporting events, those supply chains were operating a month or two ago, and now we've just shut them off. Well, there's still inventory in that pipeline. There's still orders. There's still businesses that were programmed that, had planned 12 months out to be doing work today. And so I think the thing to be aware of is we've got all three of those demand disruptions happening, triggering bullwhips that are moving and being amplified up the supply chain. And that's really driving an incredible amount of chaos that's different for every product in every industry. And the way that we solve that at the end of the day is by getting to a steady state, by getting to the place where supply and demand are in balance again.
Thank you, Daniel. That makes sense. I want to go to Bob Tribblecock is editorial director at Supply Chain Management Review. He's been a journalist for many years, an well-known figure in the industry. I want to get your insights on this, Bob. What are your initial thoughts on what is happening in the industry? Have you seen something like this happen in your entire career?
I have not, and I lived through the 1987 stock market crash and the New England banking crash and the tech crash and 2008 and all of those things. And, this is unlike, I think, anything any of us have seen. The way I've likened it, there's a famous Mike Tyson line where he was approached before a fight and somebody said, "What are you going to do? Because this guy has a plan." And Tyson said, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And, as supply chain managers, we make plans, a year in advance and 6 months in advance and a quarter in advance and a week in advance. And that's great. But what do you do when you get punched in the mouth? And it seems like, whatever industry you're in, we just took a shot and are trying to figure out, what comes next. It's hard to get supply chain managers on the phone right now. Or on an email, just because it feels like they're all just trying to survive to come out of their corner for the next round. Can they get through this one? So I don't know that right now supply chain managers have had the luxury of sitting down to wonder what's next. And what do we do? How do we write our risk management playbooks and things? So I'm going to be interested to see what happens there. Most of those companies have a playbook for what do we do if a distribution center burns down. I did a story with the Gap once, and they had their primary e-com distribution center that they brought up for peak burned down in August, a couple of months before Black Friday. Well, they had a playbook for that, and they were able to get through it. I don't think anybody has a playbook for this. So I'm going to be interested in that. And I'm also going to be watching what happens around the models for providing, equipment, automated equipment, and also services. Is it going to drive us more towards a, automation as a service model? We have robots as a service model right now. So I'm going to be interested to see what happens in the solution provider market as they try to help customers who may not have capital but still need to do things.
Okay, thank you, Bob. That's great insights, and I'm going to come back to the point of playbook because it's a very important point. I think we need something called a pandemic playbook for next time because you never know what's going to happen. Let me go to fresh insight. I'm going to go to John Monarch, the CEO of a company called ShipChain. ShipChain raised, I believe, about $30 million in their initial rounds. Blockchain technology with the management as a startup or as a company that hasn't been out there for many years, and you're trying to solve supply chains problems with technology. And this is a big disruption for a new company. How are you looking at this disruption, COVID-19, and the development of your products and solutions generally, as a quick initial insight?
Well, we see ourselves as a full visibility solution for the entire supply chain. So as everything starts to shift right now, a lot of supply chain leaders are seeing the value in having that insight and having that visibility. So I think that you'll start seeing a technology perspective come out that a lot of people have historically said that the supply chain and logistics industries have been very slow to move just because they're so large and so many moving parts. And I think that now they're starting to realize that we have to be quick, we have to be agile. And I also think you're going to start seeing, even with all that new visibility coming in, we're going to enter into like a globalism 2.0 where a lot of, this is going to be the death of the single source supply chain, for instance. So a lot of companies will say, oh, well, we're very resilient. We use multiple factories, but they're all in the same country, for instance. That's not really a very resilient supply chain setup. So you're going to start seeing more similar to what you saw in like the customer service world, where there was nearshoring, domestic shoring, but also you have that foreign component at the same time. So that way you can have a much more disaster-ready supply chain as well.
Thank you, John. Thank you. That's wonderful. So I'm going to put this onto the audiences. We have about 150 plus people watching this live stream right now. These are the ones that I can actively track right now. There's a couple of platforms I cannot see how many people are attending, but I want to put this question back to attendees who are, if you're watching this live stream, put your questions in the comment section, questions to the entire panel, and I'm going to pick a few of them and ask the relevant person what the question. That will just help us answer some immediate might have. So if you're watching on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, put your questions down there. I'm already seeing a stream of a lot of great comments. So let me do this. Abe, I'm going to go up to you. I'm going to ask you something that potentially you see as an association for supply chain professionals. You're one of the largest bodies in the world, and you work with multiple supply chains. I mean, come on, there's got to be so many different supply chains that you guys work with. Give us an insight of how complex is the world of supply chains. Perhaps help us understand what kind of have, and for those of us who don't know anything about supply chains.
It's prior to this disruption, we had a very robust not only hiring, but recognition of the role of supply chain professionals for organizations. We started to see their recognition within companies moving up to the C-suite with global supply chain officers or chief supply chain officers. I think we're going to see that accelerate as not only the recognition, but the importance and the criticality of supply chain starts to become more ubiquitous across enterprises. The challenge that we have is that this issue is not an economic issue. It's a healthcare issue that is driving an economic challenge for a lot of organizations. So supply chain professionals, as the group was pointing out, work with data. And data is critical to any decision making for organizations. As Dan was pointing out, the one thing that disrupts any supply chain, whether we're talking about oil and gas or automotive, is uncertainty and variability. When you start to see significant uncertainty and tremendous variability in demand, it challenges the supply chain, from the raw materials to the manufacturing to the distribution, as well as the logistics processes, in terms of keeping up with it. So whether you're taking a look at a surge in demand or a reduction in availability of products, the orchestration of the supply chain from the suppliers, and as we were talking about before, visibility and transparency across the supply chain is critical to understand not only your primary suppliers, but who are their suppliers and so forth down the supply chain. This is a function that has garnered a tremendous amount of attention, not only in the C-suite, but in terms of hiring. Prior to this disruption, placement for supply chain professionals coming out of school was over 90%. Starting salaries were second only to engineers. The recognition was already there. I think we're going to see this accelerated as the recognition becomes more critical for organizations.
Yeah. Abe, what I was also trying to ask is different types of supply chains. For example, Andrew is, and I'm gonna come back to you on helping understand your organization and how you impact the membership. But Andrew, we just heard about data being a pivotal thing when it comes to supply chains. You work with IDC. You guys are one of the top research firms in the world. Tell us a little bit about how does collection of data impact what we see? How do you guys collect data?
Yeah, and as it relates to supply chains, Abe made a point a second ago. What's improved in the last 5 years? So we had a similar oil price crash 4 or 5 years ago. Now we're here. Is visibility. So both on the supply chain, when you're talking about tracking, I wrote something about this in the fall. Tracking materials and products in the field, that's improved somewhat substantially. There's also been much better visibility as far as data is concerned on oil storage. So, for instance, 5 years ago when the oil price crash happened, the market was very opaque. No one knew how much oil was out there. No one knew what storage capacity was in the market. Right now we know there's enough visibility out there in the market to know that we've got about if you consider the current demand destruction, which could be anywhere from 20 million barrels a day demand destruction all the way to 35, 40, crazy numbers. We just from that alone, the increased visibility in the market allows us to know that we've probably got about 2 months of storage that can take on this increased supply or this what we've lost from the demand destruction. I think in oil and gas, we're still quite a bit behind other industries as it relates to supply chain is automating some of these things. In the last 5 years, the industry touts all these efficiency gains that we made. But if you go and look at an operation, it's still about the same. So there's still a lot of work to be done there.
So my question is, are you really getting the data right now during COVID-19? The data that you're getting from the markets, is it reliable? Because we've heard as this crisis has been unloading and offloading, data is not available and real actual factual information is not available from different markets because it's been stopped, it's been curtailed and so on. I want to go to Daniel. Daniel, you've been an industry consultant for many years. You know the industry inside out. Help us understand from a strategic perspective, what are some of the things that you would say are really important for industry right now to look at in order to plan kind of the next stages? I mean, I think we're going through the stages of grief here. We, first of all, didn't understand what's happening because we just were taken by surprise. Now we're getting in terms with, hey, there's countries are shut down, entire nations are shut down for weeks. And I think then we'll start strategizing into, okay, now what are the next steps that we should take? But I really think we should accelerate this process and get attendees, viewers in the industry to understand, hey, start thinking about your strategy right now, even though you're not in the right place. But give us some insight on your philosophy, and you're an author, you're a really well-known advocate. What should we start looking at when we're thinking about recovery and the process?
There's some things that we need to be aware of to do right, and there are some things so to call out and make sure that we're thinking about strategically is, over the last few years, as we've made huge improvements in forecasting, what we've really been doing is taking data from the past and using that to project into the future. And one of the challenges with what's happening right now is the recent past does not represent what the near future is going to look like. And so that's going to require us to be conscious about looking at our quantitative forecasts and adapting those qualitatively. So that's one, is understanding quantitative and qualitative forecasting and making sure that as we're planning for the future, we're using our judgment, not just using statistics from the past. The second one, orchestration. We need to be able to see what's happening in our supply chains, and we need to be able to see it quickly so that we can respond and react intelligently. We also need to be working with our partners, and that means our customers, and on ways to orchestrate the. Is making sure that we have visibility and the ability to move fast. The third one that I think we really need to pay a lot of attention to is protecting the people that are working in the supply chain today. One of the changes that I think we need to be seeing is changes in processes and changes in the way that we're managing the people that work in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, that work in transportation, driving truck and trains and around, people that work in warehouses and distribution centers. Because if we're not protecting all of those people in the supply chains, then we're leaving the supply chains vulnerable to the disease.
Absolutely. And I have a question on the, thank you, Daniel. I have a question on the screen. What are the top 5 disruptions we'll witness in supply chains post-COVID-19? Really great question. Bob, I want to go to you and ask you your opinion on what are you seeing as the impact post-COVID-19, some of the things that will change based on what you've seen happen in the industry. Bob?
Yeah, so the 2 or 3 things I've been thinking about. One is I did a call with an analyst last week who does a lot of advising about sourcing and network and things like that. And one of the things he said to me is that the pandemic is going to accelerate some changes that have already been going on in the last year or so as a result of trade fights and tariffs and things like that, which is companies having to reevaluate their sourcing strategies. So are we going to, now what that looks like, I don't know quite yet, but and I'll give you a couple of trains of thought, but companies are going to have to rethink where they're getting supplies from, and probably think about shorter supply chains. Now, one move, people wonder, will that mean reshoring, nearshoring? Will we bring it, for instance, for our market, will we bring it back to North America? I think what you might see, the guys at MIT did some research on this, and one of the things that they concluded was that companies weren't really reshoring. What they were doing was moving production closer to demand. So maybe they were bringing something back to North America to be closer to North America, but they weren't going to ship from North America to Europe. They were going to also build supply chains in Europe to serve the European market. So I think that trend was ongoing anyway, just because of trade issues and tariff issues, we're probably going to see an acceleration of that.
And this is of course talking about as well on the entire planet's dependency on China being a manufacturing base for everything that comes out of China. We all are using products out of China, and we love these products. They have a really great price point, but then it's the question of this vulnerability on supply chains, and should we have a distributed network of supply? Is that what you're talking about, Bob?
Yes, I think people are going to have to rethink their sourcing strategies. At the same time, whenever I hear someone say, well, we're just going to get out of China, I don't know that anybody's ready, willing, and able to pay $40,000 for a Honda Civic. So, you've got a market of consumers that is accustomed to cheap prices. And somehow or another, you're going to have to balance sourcing with what is the consumer willing to pay, because we've had a couple of decades of prices just coming down and down and down, and the value that you get for that price going up and up and up. Yeah. I think another of those trends, again, going back to the automation idea, I was watching, I ordered something online from a well-known company that I buy in the store all the time, but the store was closed. And I live in a little town in New Hampshire, about 90 miles from Hartford, Connecticut. And this company has a big distribution center in Hartford, Connecticut. So I normally get things the next day, just as a matter of rule. And they quoted me 10 days in terms of delivery. They beat it, but it was still 8 days. I could have walked there and back in less than 8 days. That's fine in this time. You cut people slack. I didn't need it, so I wanted it. I didn't need it, so 8 days was fine. When we get back to normal, if we see this shift to e-commerce, companies are going to have to continue to invest in their e-commerce capabilities. So again, going back to this idea of automation as a service, I'm going to be watching to see what people do from a capital expenditure, because they're going to have no choice but to invest if they want to continue to compete. And I guess the third thing, we've seen this real move towards automation in recent years because we had a 3.5% unemployment rate. Well, now if you have 10 million people looking for jobs, are we going to go back to, warehouses that are relatively manual and you can throw a lot of warm bodies, or, manufacturing lines where you could throw a lot of warm bodies at it because labor was cheap and plentiful? I don't know. But, somehow or another, we're going to have to figure out what to do with, all these folks. And I don't know if the availability of labor is going to change the kind of calculations that companies make when they look at automation.
Now, thank you, Bob. One of the things that is coming out of all of this is for the supply chain industry generally to be more efficient, more lean. I'm getting a lot of feedback and comments here as well. Is how do we create more efficiency? How do supply chains are more trustworthy when it comes to transactions? And I'm going to go over to John. John, you're a blockchain company. Blockchain is the trust technology. It's smart contracts are accelerating the process of handover of data and information. We're eliminating silos of information and putting them all on just one single blockchain. Where are we going with respect to creating efficiency in the supply chain industry and using technology as an accelerator?
Well, technology and blockchain specifically are just one tool, and it's not going to be the cure-all for everything, but it is a tool that can help us. It's really useful in supply chain specifically because you have a lot of actors that don't necessarily trust each other, but at the same time, there has to be trust in that system, and there has to be that one underlying system. So we firmly, believe in public blockchains, for instance, because a lot of corporations have been testing out private networks, but now there's been a move towards using that one mainnet layer, and we're seeing, a lot of the consulting firms and other supply chain companies start seeing that as well, simply because they don't have to necessarily trust the single administrator of the platform. So if there's even though a lot of companies are testing out blockchain, it may not really be on that ethos, simply because there's still one company or one administrator that can control the entire process, can read all of your data, can delete your data, can edit your data. And one of the things I did see in the questions and comments here is how do we get developing countries and low and middle income countries on board with these new visibility technologies? And that's a critical question. And we have to do it in a way that's going to be much more ubiquitous. So it's going to come down to using mobile phones. Most countries now, even in developing countries, are seeing a move towards smartphones. Even in countries that do not have ubiquitous smartphone technology, there's still a lot of cellular tech. And that can be anything from sending an SMS that automatically pings to an ERP system, or just being able to have a little bit of extra connectivity and visibility over what they have now is leaps and bounds ahead of where we have been over the past few years.
Yep. One of the things that I've observed is everybody is using whatever they have in whatever way they can to make things work. And it's the case of work from home and using different technologies, and we're using a platform to do this today. I was talking with a government that's a government in Central Asia, and they've used SMS technology to issue alerts and issue permits for people who have to go out and come, go out of their home. And there's so many different examples of technology being used in a way that we've been put in a box and given a pencil and a crayon to say, hey, put your ideas on this paper right now. You have 60 seconds to do it. So in one way, it's a really great exercise for us to come up with extremely good ideas. There's tons and tons of questions, and I'm gonna start answering. We're gonna start answering some of them. The first one is somebody asked that if it's there on the screen. Given the situation, no, not this one. There was another one on what is our lessons learned from past pandemics, and we really haven't had any past pandemics like this. The last one was almost 100 years ago. So to answer that question, I don't believe there's any lessons from that from the past. Let's see. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience right now. Lack of production. So I have Dr. Vignesh who's saying, in the case of world supply chain managers, many supply chain associates are standing still in their supplies because of lack of production. Is there any solution to those supply chains? Now, I've also heard, and it's news, it's different reports that have come out, that a lot of produced goods were just sitting at factories because there was nobody to transport them because of the breakdown. I want to answer this question. Let's see, but Andrew, from an oil and gas supply chain perspective, did you see supplies being held off because there was no way of transporting them? And I'm going to take that question to somebody else after this.
Yeah, absolutely, and to some degree, can you hear me? The industry, as I mentioned before, did kind of go through this where there was a huge supply demand disruption because of prices 5 years ago. So you did see equipment start piling up in the field. So there's a lot of companies now using AI-enabled supply chain platforms to now address this, to make sure they're keeping, letting leading indicators and letting predictive analytics manage that for them. So the learnings that we got 5 years ago have increased the adoption of some of that technology.
And what's the impact of this on, let's say manufacturing? Daniel, what do you think the impact of this will be on manufacturing? That goods are being produced, they're sitting in factories ready to be transported. There's nobody there to transport them. How does it change manufacturing in itself? Or do you think we're going to get into more lean manufacturing, just in time? What do you think?
I think lean manufacturing allows the supply chain to be very responsive to changes. But I think the piece that we need to have in place is really good demand sensing. So you need to be able to go as far down the supply chain as you can, as close to the consumer, understand what they're really buying, what they're really using, and then use that to orchestrate, to synchronize the manufacturing and the transportation to make sure that we're delivering the goods and the value that those consumers want.
Thank you. And I can see there's a bit of lag. Coming in from your side. Let's take another question. Jonathan says, Jonathan says, aside from blockchain, AI has come to the forefront as a technology of the future. I've seen solutions that use AI for forecasting. What other uses can you see AI in supply chain? I actually want to take that question to Abe. Abe, as an association, as a leading body where you have different members and member bases, and I know you do a lot of work with through different partnership. You work with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the AI Foundation. What are you seeing in terms of conversations that are coming up with technology, COVID-19, and where industry should go forward?
This really does endorse and support a lot of the discussion that we've had in the past, and that is the shift to a much more digitally focused supply chain. But one of the challenges that we have with machine learning and artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things is the critical thinking and the decision process and the discernment of the supply chain professionals, the managers that are in the process. This is not a plug and play type activity for technology. If it were, you're going to end up with the bullwhip effect magnified to a much higher level, because AI, as well as machine learning, is dependent on the information that you've provided it in the past to forecast appropriately into the future. As we indicated before, when you end up with these once in a lifetime activities, how do you account for that as part of your decision-making process on what to source, what to manufacture, what to deliver, what to store? So a lot of the AI and the digital transformation has been enabling organizations to respond when there's consistent demand and the supply is plentiful for addressing the demand or the consumers or the patients. We have to remember that, just in time and the lean manufacturing worked well. We had a very efficient economy. What doesn't work well is when you have surge or you have sort of pent up demand or an increase in demand for a very short time period with the rationing and or the hoarding that's occurred. So AI, machine learning, and all the technology solutions are critical to respond, but you have to have that critical decision-making process incorporated into the final decisions that organizations make. It's not AI alone. It is the combination of the AI and the supply chain professionals, as well as the sustainability professionals, your sales teams. It is a coordinated effort. It is not just the technology solution that's going to get us out of this out of this disruption.
Thank you. I have a question by Jessel who asks that, and Bob, this is a question coming up for you. Jessel is a recent graduate, and he wants to know whether the supply chain job market is expected to be hot in the next quarter. Now, I don't want to focus on whether it's going to be hot or not, but I want to focus on the people side of the industry, employees. There's thousands and thousands of layoffs that are happening right now across different industries across the world. So what are we looking at in terms of people fulfilling demand? And we've got automation, amazing. We've got automation, AI, blockchain, and all of these cool things that are happening. But then there's also people side of the equation within industry, recent new graduates or people with skills who are ready to join the workforce. What are you seeing with respect to demand for employment, or how companies will change how they work with people as employees by hiring them?
Well, so first to the specific question, I don't think any of us know. I'll give you one anecdote. I have a daughter who lives in Chicago. She's in her 30s, and a friend of hers was a logistics manager for a well-known restaurant chain, and was laid off because all of the restaurants in that chain are closed. It was a national chain, but they've closed all their restaurants, so they didn't need a logistics manager. She was laid off, and my daughter called and said, "Hey, can you help her get some interviews?" So two very different responses. I called a supply chain leader I know at a very well-known medical distribution company, and he said, "We're hiring, so have her send me her resume. It's just a matter of whether she fits in a hole that I'm trying to plug, but we're looking for people." I also contacted an acquaintance at a well-known pharmaceutical chain who said, we're just trying to hang on to the people we have, and we're going to have to do layoffs. So, she ought to look elsewhere. So I think it's going to be industry dependent. There are industries right now that are, going 100 miles an hour because of the sector that they're in, who are still looking for people. And there are industries that have been idled who are probably figuring out, well, who are we going to have to lay off and furlough, and certainly aren't thinking about hiring new people. That said, this isn't going to go on forever, and supply chains are going to have to come back to life and hire people. And, the thing that I hear repeatedly, and I'm actually going to give a shout out to Abe because he brought this to my attention at the ASCM meeting last fall, which is that we're turning out a lot of kids with great technical skills, and we need people with technical skills. But right now, there's a shortage of people with people skills. So you're getting particularly recent graduates coming into the field who've been taught a lot about software and this and that, but haven't developed the people skills and the business skills for their organizations. And that's something that I think companies are looking for. I know we've done some stories in SCMR with like Caterpillar, where this was an issue, and they were having to develop programs, about how to bring those, young associates and those young managers into the workforce in a way they can get along with everyone. So I think young people coming out, yes, think about your technical skills, but also think about those soft skills. Abe, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think everybody has experienced the shift in the leadership for supply chain. It used to be a very technically based competency that individuals were successful with. Now, with supply chain being prevalent across the entire enterprise, from the not only raw materials all the way to the sustainability, recycling, reusing, waste, organizations and individuals have to work across enterprises and across functions. It is no longer just the man or the woman sitting in the back office developing production plans. The coordination that's required to address patients and consumer demand across a globe, especially for the large multinationals, as well as small and medium-sized businesses that support those large multinationals. They're challenged right now, and anything we can do to facilitate a more normalized purchasing pattern, I think we're all better off when we think about the collective as opposed to our individual needs. And supply chain professionals are uniquely qualified working across the enterprise, and it is rewarding to see individuals being recognized for their contributions. Too often, supply chain was a sort of a misnomer in terms of what it accomplished, and more importantly, the benefits and the impact that it provided. I think the term ubiquitous was used before. Not less than 2 to 3 weeks ago, we had to explain what supply chain was to everybody in the world. Now we're having to defend supply chain to everybody in the world, and that it does support and that it does address the unique challenges that we have. It will take time, but it will happen.
There's an interesting question that somebody's posted, that when all of this is over, how will supply chains deal with the drastic increase in demand? And I think there definitely will be bottlenecks that we'll have to. It'll be a good problem to have, as they say. Does anybody want to take that question, Daniel?
Well, I think there will be increase in demand for some products, but the part of managing the bullwhip effect is making gradual changes. One of the guys I worked with at Caterpillar years ago, at Ed Rapp, talked about it's like lifting a barbell, and it needs to be an even lift, right? If you lift too hard on one side or too hard on the other, weights are going to fall off the end. And so I think that's going to be the challenge for us in the months and the years ahead, is, coming back to that new normal, but trying to do it gradually, evenly, working with our suppliers and our customers to bring it up to the level of where the actual demand is at.
Absolutely. So we're having tons of engagement. There's so many different questions, and it's impossible for us to put all of them up on screen. I do want to encourage all of the panelists even to ask questions to each other. If needed, please feel free. Do not hesitate. I want to go into the last 10 minutes of this live stream. And thank you again, everybody, all the panelists and all the viewers for being part of this emergency COVID-19 recovery session. And how do we work with the supply chain industry? What should supply chains do? Some of the things that I have now noticed throughout this session is there's a little bit of focus on things will not recover right away. It'll take a little bit of time for them to recover. Nobody knows what that time recovery and that time period is. I think there's an immediate need of understanding where we are and then actioning. I see some themes. I see engagement, changing business models for sales, for marketing, for partner enablement, having a big reset or a refresh that supply chains need to kind of enable. There's the people side of things where we need to understand what happens with people, and people on the other side, employees, need to understand the impact of these changes on them, and maybe perhaps look into learning, look into acquiring new skills. And this is a great time to do that right now. Plenty of options available online, offline. We talked about playbook, a new pandemic playbook. So I'm going to go into the question of, if we had a pandemic playbook, what would be in it? What would be the business models? I'll go into that right now. We've looked at technology. Some newer technologies may help make efficiency gains, collaboration, and so on and so forth. So let's do this. Let's say we have a pandemic playbook right away. We need to create a pandemic. Go ahead.
The one other piece I wanted to add as we're talking about people is I think it's really important to incorporate safety and really a concern for the work in the supply chain and our customers. And that's really, at some level, we've always thought about safety in terms of ergonomics and repetitive motion injuries, those sorts of things. I think this whole idea of contagion and protecting our workers from catching and spreading disease and insulating our customers from potential diseases is something very new that we have to start thinking about when we engineer and manage our supply chains.
Thank you, Daniel. That makes perfect sense. And we're looking at health being this one thing that's being affected across the board, and that's why we have a pandemic. And how do different industries, whether it's supply chain, manufacturing, accounting, whatever the industry is, how do we have this new area within our business called healthcare? What is the best thing to do when it's about your employees, your teams, your partners being healthy? I think many new managers, a lot of organizations are going to start thinking about this point, and it's a great point. Let's get into the last session. I'm going to take a quick look on what people are saying. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, for your amazing comments. Let's get into final comments and advice. If we had a pandemic playbook for the supply chain industry going forward from now until the next 2 years, what is the advice that all of our panelists would give you and give our viewers and give industry, that here are the top 3 things, perhaps, that there could be 4 or 5 things as well, but top 3, what is it that you would put in this pandemic playbook? Let me go, first of all, to Abe Eshkenazi, CEO of the Association of Supply Chain Management. Tell us what goes in this pandemic playbook the way you see it.
I think it's going to be a fundamental shift for supply chain professionals in the entire industry. It used to be with forecasting and accuracy on your sales and your demand were driving most of businesses right now, considering that we were in a very robust economy prior to this. What's going to be added is risk and resiliency. And a risk is going to take on a much bigger profile within organizations because, as Bob and the panelists had indicated before, we've had disruptions to supply chains before, whether they be environmental or terrorism or other types of significant economic disruptions. The challenge that we have now is responsiveness. How quickly can we be and how agile can we be in the various industries that support a response to a pandemic? So do we have surge capacity to develop medical equipment or medical supplies for our frontline workers? it is not functional to have redundant capacity because factories just don't sit idle. So the question is, can we develop agile manufacturing and supply chains to respond to these types of disruptions, knowing the impact is far greater if we don't do anything? So the challenge is going to be for supply chain professionals to develop risk and resiliency and responsive mechanisms. And I think we should not forget sustainable activities, that the changes that are going to be made need to be sustainable. So they need to account obviously for the economic impact, but also the ecological and the ethical impact of changes to supply chain. So the landscape for supply chain and for supply chain professionals has expanded. Their role and responsibility has gone well beyond just a perfect order for the supplier or for the the customer or the patient. So we're going to have to develop a much more robust and agile manufacturing that can address these types of surge and or demands in the marketplace. These shocks are happening much more frequently than they have over the past 100 years, over the past 10 to 15 years. And so risk, resiliency, and sustainability need to be part of our collective conversation in terms of responding to these types of disruptions.
Thank you so much, Abe. Thank you. That makes perfect sense. And I'm writing them down. I'll summarize all of these. Andrew, over to you. What are the 3 points that you would say are necessary for supply chain pandemic playbook?
I'll defer to my fellow supply chain experts, specifically as it relates to supply chain, but I'll touch on one thing specific to my industry, is that one thing we've learned is that a lot of companies that everyone knows, I mean, these are brand name companies, were not prepared on a technology front to operate in an environment like this. So, you've got a number of in-house HSE people, but as Dan mentioned before, they're thinking about everyday operational safety type measures and not thinking about a context like this. So, being able to operate in a separated, disparate situation is something that has to be addressed if this were to ever happen again in our lifetime.
Thank you. Let's go to Bob. Bob, give us your 3 top takeaways for a pandemic playbook, something that we can do right away.
Well, I think first I'm going to echo Daniel because for all the talk about these wonderful new technologies, AI and IoT and all of those things, supply chains are people-focused operations. We don't have lights out factories yet, lights out warehouses. You still have truck drivers. We're going to have to come up with a playbook that says, if this hits, how can we continue to operate in a manner that is safe and healthy for our associates? And as Daniel said, I'm going to echo him again. We're not talking about a back brace so that you don't put your back out from bending or dislocate your shoulder from lifting. It's going to be about, how do I operate in a safe manner and keep those around me safe? I think people are going to have to not just think about who are their suppliers, but one of the lessons from 2008 is that so many suppliers went out of business that when we did ramp up for demand, and so many companies got lean and lean and lean, that when demand did ramp up, they weren't able to meet demand and lost sales to competitors. So companies from an operational standpoint, a procurement standpoint, are going to have to think about, how do we ramp down, but how do we also protect those people in our network so that we can ramp up when demand comes back? To me, I think those are going to be the 2 most important things. That latter, goes along to the resiliency thing. I know it's easy to ramp down. It's painful, but you just lay people off and you turn the lock and the key. It's harder to ramp back up and get supplies in and make things and get deliveries. So, how we operate safely, and then second, how do we wind down, but how do we also protect our base so that we can wind back up?
Thank you, Bob. Over to John. John, you're the technology guy. You're the technology company. Tell us what we should expect or do, or what can companies in the supply chain industry think about doing when it comes to surviving, surpassing, bouncing back over the next couple of years.
You know, you can't manage what you can't see. So that's where visibility is going to play a critical role in all of this across every type of supply chain. One of the big ones that's going on right now is food, and you're seeing grocery stores kind of struggle to keep stock. And at the same time, there's stories out there about farmers having to dump milk and then all of this food getting wasted. And a lot of that is just this imbalance of where things need to go. So along with visibility, the ability to have, I guess, almost smart marketplaces or quickly moving marketplaces where supply chains can look in places that they traditionally would not have. So for instance, grocery stores have started looking at restaurant supply companies that might be overstocked in certain parts. So that way, these restaurant supply companies still have the business, even though the actual restaurants are shut down, but grocery stores are able to get what they need to stock the shelves. And really on a pandemic playbook, you can't, for my third point, you can't really expect everyone to have 100% safety all the time. For instance, we can't tell everyone on the coast, board up your windows 365 days a year because there might be a hurricane. It's just not practical. So at the same time, we have to think about those, surge capacities, being able to prepare for those spikes, being within those standard deviations at the same time. So that's where the being able to see things, but also being able to quickly look in places that you may not have and work with companies that you previously never would have expected to work with and have those relationships in play just in case.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And we go to Daniel. Daniel, you, Mr. Supply Chain, you have the final word. Give us your pandemic playbook strategy. 3 things, perhaps. What should we do? What should industry do? We've had almost 300 people across different networks watching this live transmission. I want to thank everybody for being here and hanging out for the next 1 hour. Final word, Daniel, and then we'll close off.
I think the key, Ian, is to think about supply chain planning in terms of insurance. So I'll use toilet paper as an example. We're all very spoiled that we can go to the store and we've got a broad selection of toilet paper to choose from, and there's normally a really high level of availability, and it's cheap. And the reason that's the case is because of lean global supply chains. What we're finding now, though, is that that leanness that helps to drive out the costs can also impact availability. And so the question that I would ask is, okay, knowing that there is this potential for variability, how much would you as a manufacturer, you as a retailer, or you as a consumer, how much would you be willing to pay for an insurance policy that would guarantee that if an event like this happened, you would still have enough toilet paper to meet your needs? Whatever that amount is, the point at which you go, yeah, I would pay that much for an insurance policy, but I wouldn't pay any more. Well, that's the amount of money that you should be spending on these other mitigation techniques that we've talked about. Better visibility, more manufacturing capacity, additional inventory stockpiled at the right places in the supply chain. Because that's the challenge, is we have a lot of good solutions out there, but we can't make a business case for any of them unless we can show the value. And the key is to say, okay, let's pretend that that's an insurance policy. That's something we can all relate to. We'll use that as our baseline for value and then make investments up to that amount to mitigate the risk.
Thank you, Daniel. That makes perfect sense. Let me try and bring everything together. It's 1 o'clock. We're at the end of our session. I want to thank everybody, first of all, for being here, staying online for the last 1 hour. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to this channel because that makes us go forward. That makes us have the next episode up. It's as simple as clicking subscribe. Here are the insights from today's session really, really quickly. We need to develop agile manufacturing to a level where we are looking at risk mitigation, building more resilience, building more sustainability. We heard that we need to look at safety and health of our teams, how to ramp down production when needed, and how to protect the network. We also heard that we cannot measure what we cannot see, and so visibility deep into your value chain, into your supply chain is necessary. And great examples of toilet paper it's kind of the signature of this whole pandemic is evaluate your entire business, evaluate everything that's happening in your business, and see what can you optimize, what can you not optimize. There's no playbook that was written for a pandemic before, and I think it's an opportunity to recreate and create something that we can all follow, we can all share. My final advice to everybody is keep learning every single day right now during this time of crises, because that's the only thing that keeps us informed and keeps us going. Do some courses from online platforms, whether it's a Coursera or whatever is out there, but start learning about things and add new skills to your repository. Again, please subscribe to this channel. Thank you so much, everybody who's on the panel. Andrew Myers, Bob Tribblecock, John Monarch, Abe Ashkenazi, and Mr. Supply Chain, Daniel Stanton. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I really value your time, and thank you so much. Stay safe, viewers, panelists. Until next time, next Wednesday we have manufacturing. So see you next Wednesday. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.